Here's the problem, Charlie Kirk. If you steal something and then you give it back, that doesn't change the fact that you're a thief.
In the wake of the student debt crisis, stagnant wage growth across all education levels in all fields, liberal arts, STEM, how is regurgitating this far left talking point of stapling green cards to diplomas America first? How is this any different than chain migration funded by taxpayers through the NSF, DOE, DOD? Those funds go to...
Yeah, I'm happy to elaborate on it. So I said at a speech last week that if someone graduates from a four-year college, they should have a green card stapled to their diploma. Let me elaborate on that further. I don't think it makes sense as America First to invest our tax dollars in foreign nationals that come to our own publicly funded universities and then say go back and compete against us in Korea, Japan, or Southeast Asia.
First place, then.
Well, so you just said they're competing against us here. Well, actually, if they're employed by American companies or they're entrepreneurs, there's evidence to show that they actually embrace our American cultural identity and they come and they immerse into our country. So
hello, everyone. I've got 3 different topics I'm going to be talking about today. The first is Charlie Kirk's Turning Point USA gets caught trying to steal $1.2 million from small businesses. Secondly, supply chain problems caused by the coronavirus are finally causing some lawmakers to wake up and discover the fact that the United States economy is full of monopolies. Finally, how some mortgage companies such as Amerihome are using the financial crisis caused by the coronavirus as an excuse to steal people's homes. Turning Point USA claims to be all about entrepreneurship and American small businesses. The more Americans participating in the US economy, the better. As Charlie Kirk scolds people in his audience, you don't have to worry about competition from immigrants. These are just people looking to start their own businesses. They're not going to compete with you. It's not like the United States is a nation of limited resources. That's why I was quite surprised to see that Turning Point USA not only applied for, but also was given a $1.2 million taxpayer loan from the Paycheck Protection Program. You know, the program that was supposed to be helping struggling American small businesses, the program that ran out of money almost instantaneously because all of the money ended up going to huge corporations or politically connected entities like Turning Point USA. In what alternate reality would Turning Point USA ever qualify as a struggling American small business? This is an organization that's funded by billionaires. The Koch brothers and various other billionaires bankroll Turning Point USA because it props up a sort of conservatism that they agree with. A sort of conservative that is only concerned with libertarian economic policy and aggressive U.S. warfare strategy in the Middle East. Social conservative, restrictions on immigration, common good capitalism, these are all things that have no place in the conservative movement, according to organizations like Turning Point USA. With access to a vast pool of billionaire donors, Turning Point USA has virtually limitless resources available to it. Charlie Kirk himself draws a salary well above 6 figures. So why on earth did Turning Point USA ever apply for a loan under the Paycheck Protection Program to begin with? Was it that they just hoped to get free money from the government that they wouldn't have to pay back? I thought Turning Point USA, being this beacon of fiscal conservatism in libertarian politics, would be opposed to accepting free government money. Wouldn't they rather this money go to people who were actual entrepreneurs, actual small business people? You know, people who produce products and services that people pay for, that aren't reliant on the support of billionaires in order to keep operations going? Why would Turning Point USA even need a Paycheck Protection Program loan to begin with? How are their finances impacted by the coronavirus. They don't sell anything. They don't sell a service, they don't sell a product. Are you telling me that because of the coronavirus, billionaire donors are no longer interested in giving them money? I just find that awfully hard to believe. With support for immigration at an all-time low due to the virus, if anything, the expectation would be that they'd receive more donor money. Of course, now that they've been caught having applied for and received this loan, Turning Point USA is now vowing to return the money to the federal government. Here's the problem, Charlie Kirk. If you steal something and then you give it back, that doesn't change the fact that you're a thief. You received a $1.2 million loan through the Paycheck Protection Program. Meanwhile, when someone like me applied for the same Paycheck Protection Program for my one employee, I didn't get diddly squat. You got $1.2 million. My business got nothing. Millions of other American small businesses that applied for this program got nothing. While you're doing the right thing by returning this money, you never should have applied for the loan in the first place. Even if that money is now redistributed to small businesses, for thousands of American businesses, it's too late at this point. The fact that Turning Point USA would even contemplate applying for loans under this program is baffling. In what world would Turning Point USA ever properly be interpreted as a small business? The second topic I wanted to talk about is some recent revelations that some congressmen have had about the meat industry in the United States. The issue has come about due to the issue of some slaughterhouses having trouble continuing operations during the coronavirus. Some of the United States' larger slaughterhouses, particularly those concerned with butchering larger mammal animals such as cows and pigs, have been having problems recently. These slaughterhouses remained open even after stay-at-home orders were put into place because the work was deemed essential. Millions of American restaurants depend on a steady supply of beef and pork in order to continue operation. The problem was, though, is that in regards to these slaughterhouses that specifically slaughter large animals, they require workers to work side by side one another in dense working conditions in order to butcher meat. It's an assembly line-like process. So while these slaughterhouses continued to operate after stay-at-home, they had major problems in that their employees started to receive mass infections of coronavirus. Unable to guarantee its employees safe working conditions, a lot of these slaughterhouses started to close. The federal government then got involved, and Donald Trump invoked the Defense Production Act to force these slaughterhouses to remain open. This whole controversy alerted the fact to Congress people like Representative Hawley that the meat industry in the United States was monopolized. Market power was concentrated between just a few meat companies that were responsible for supplying all of the meat to the United States. This was largely responsible for this problem in the first place. If America had a lot of different meat companies that competed against each other in the free market, then it would have slaughterhouses located across the country. That way, if a few of the slaughterhouses had issue with coronavirus, those could close, but then the other slaughterhouses could help fill the gap. But because there's so few slaughterhouses, because market power is so concentrated amongst only a few companies, then something like this becomes a huge problem. As a result of this, Josh Hawley has sent a letter to the Federal Trade Commission referring the U.S. meat industry for investigation in the possible monopoly antitrust violations. Unfortunately, the beleaguered, impotent Federal Trade Commission is unlikely to be able to do anything regarding this problem. For as far back as my lifetime, the FTC has stood idly by while industry after industry in the United States monopolized. Decades of both Republican and Democratic presidential administrations flooding the government with government officials who adopted right-wing libertarian ideology when it comes to things like antitrust law has seen to it that these laws aren't enforced. Likewise, the minuscule budgets given to government agencies like the Federal Trade Commission and Department of Justice has ensured that the resources do not exist to actually go after companies that form monopolies in the United States. It is far from just the meat industry that's affected by this. Market power is heavily concentrated in perhaps even a majority of US industries. This is certainly true of the cell phone companies that charge Americans far more than what Europeans are charged for the same service. It's absolutely true when it comes to internet service. Americans pay 3 to 5 times for their internet service what Europeans do. The airline industry in the United States is absolutely monopolized. Europeans pay about a third per mile flown that Americans do. The US healthcare system, a large part of the reason why it's so expensive is that it operates as a monopoly. You may have lots of different hospitals in the city you live, but if you do a deep dive, you'll find that it's only 1 or 2 companies that operates all of those hospitals. This is one of several reasons why the United States has the highest healthcare costs in the world. The US economy is also filled with examples of monopsonies. What is a monopsony? A monopsony is when one employer dominates the labor supply. You may think that's pretty unusual. After all, in most American cities, there's lots of different places a worker could work at. Let's say you live in a moderately sized city with about 500,000 people in it, and you go to college and you get an engineering degree. You then start looking for a job and you find out there's only one employer in your small size city that employs the type of engineers for which you've gotten that degree for. Once you get a job at that employer, there's really no other place you can work at without leaving the city. Therefore, that employer enjoys a monopsony over the labor supply. It doesn't have to treat its workers with respect. It doesn't have to increase their pay ever, because there's nowhere else for them to go. These monopsonies exist all over the place in the US economy. Typically, the only time you hear anyone bring up monopolies anymore is in the context of the tech companies. The only thing though is the tech companies aren't really monopolies in the traditional sense. America's monopoly law is traditionally aimed at preventing certain companies from gaining market concentration, which would allow them to jack up the prices, thus screwing over the consumer. This is certainly what's happened in many of the industries I've already talked about, including airlines, healthcare, internet service, as well as cell phone service. However, in regards to the tech companies, they're not anti-competitive with any of the prices. Look at something like Amazon. Amazon prices are very competitive in the marketplace. They're not using their status as the dominant online retailer to rip off consumers. Likewise, look at something like Google or YouTube, which is owned by Google. Google offers access to its services to consumers for free. In exchange, the consumers are given advertisements. Google does not use the fact that it's the dominant search engine program or the dominant video program in order to rip off advertisers. Google's prices are competitive with other potential advertisement mediums. So at least from the perspective of the traditional monopoly laws in the United States, the tech companies don't actually seem to be in violation. But that's not to say that they're not up to something nefarious. Josh Hawley, for example, recently referred Amazon to the Federal Trade Commission for some activity that was doing, which I don't believe would constitute traditional antitrust activity, but which certainly seems like it should be illegal. Amazon allows third-party companies to sell their product through their website. Apparently, though, Amazon has been harvesting this data, analyzing how these third-party companies do business, and then it's been using this data in order to create its own competitors to these companies. Amazon's competitors, however, have a huge advantage because they don't have to pay any sort of royalties to Amazon in order to sell these products over their website. In this way, Amazon is not exploiting the fact that it's dominated market concentration in order to screw over the consumer. It's instead using the fact that it's created a de facto monopoly over the online marketplace to leverage an advantage for itself over potential competitors. Now, I'm not sure whether the antitrust laws we have on the books right now would cover something like this, but I think this is an area of the law that is badly overdue for an update. We need to update these antitrust laws so they can deal with problems that we have with contemporary tech companies. Google is a prime example of this. Again, there doesn't appear to be anything that Google is doing right now that is anti-consumer. Nonetheless, given the fact that Google has established a de facto monopoly of the medium of which most people have access to information in the United States, Google has managed to accumulate vast political power. As a company that has no democratic accountability, that has made it clear that it views itself as a citizen of the world and not loyal to the United States whatsoever, the fact that they exercise so much political control over the access Americans have to information is deeply disturbing. Again, America's antitrust laws didn't really anticipate something like this happen. That's not what these laws are designed to combat, but it's still a major concern. It just amazes me how many of these monopolies have been allowed to proliferate in the United States, with our own lawmakers being completely oblivious to them. In the recent presidential primary, you saw so many Democratic candidates campaign on things like a Green New Deal, on implementing new socialist policies, on making college free, or forgiving student loans. All a candidate would really have to do is just promise to enforce the antitrust laws that we have on the books, and to the average American family, that would do more to put more money in their pocket than any of these proposed socialist programs. Yet I can't think of any major presidential contender in my lifetime that ever ran on a platform of tough enforcement of antitrust and monopoly laws. It's like a key part of what made America's economy so strong has just been lost. The final story that I wanted to talk about is how some US mortgage companies are planning on using the coronavirus as an excuse to steal people's homes. This is part of a massive financial scheme that we saw play out all over the country during the last financial crisis. Several families applied for a mortgage forbearance with loan company Amerihome in order to have their loan payments deferred till after the economy reopened. Upon completing their paperwork, they were informed that they received a 3-month loan deferral. And at the end of the 3 months, they would have to pay a balloon payment that consisted of the mortgage payment from all 3 of those months. This, of course, defeats the entire purpose for forbearance. If you can't pay your mortgage for 3 months because you're out of work, it's not going to help you to then be required to pay all 3 months worth of mortgage payments at the end of the 3-month period. You don't have the income coming in order to be able to afford that balloon payment. So why would a mortgage company like Amerihome be setting up its customers to fail? After all, doesn't it want these customers to continue paying them? Well, here's how the scam works. If you are a mortgage company and you end up foreclosing on a house because of non-payment, you will receive whatever remainder of the principal has not been paid from the federal government. That's because the federal government guarantees the principal amount on any U.S. mortgage. So if someone buys a house through a mortgage company and they pay 10% of the price of the house, and then the house gets foreclosed on, the remaining 90% of the principal is provided to that mortgage company by the United States government. Now, this is a big deal because if you're a mortgage company, there are a lot of reasons why you would want that mortgage principal back immediately rather than 30 years in the future. In addition to that, these mortgage companies can charge fees for the foreclosure. So for example, if the mortgage company charges you $5,000 worth of fees, and let's say you've paid $10,000 in mortgage principal, well, it can deduct those fees from the principal. Now you've only paid $5,000 in mortgage principal, and whatever remainder of the principal the mortgage company can get from the federal government. So in this way, the mortgage company gets above and beyond the mortgage principal by the act of foreclosing on the house. Now, in exchange for this, the mortgage company does give up any interest that it would have received from the home buyer if they had continued to make their payments. This is why many mortgage companies, when you get a mortgage with them, for the first several years, majority of the money you pay goes towards not the principal, but the interest. That's because the mortgage company wants to get as much of that interest paid up front, because if they have to foreclose on the house, that money that they've already charged you in interest, they get to keep all of that. So why would a company want to give up remaining interest payments in order to foreclose on these houses? One big reason could be that the house is almost already paid off, in which case the mortgage company has already been paid majority of the interest. However, the big scam is to use these houses as a way to generate massive short-term profits. How does something like that work? Well, through predatory practices like these balloon payments, the mortgage companies will foreclose on anywhere from tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of houses. This, of course, will give the mortgage company a huge cash infusion because the federal government will pay them the entirety of the remaining mortgage principal of all of these houses. The banks will then take all of these houses and sell them to a private equity firm in a single bulk transaction. This will generate the bank a massive amount of short-term profit. After all, the mortgage company just received the entire principal amount of what all of these houses are worth from the federal government, to the extent that it's selling these houses in bulk for less than what they're worth normally on the marketplace. All of that money coming in is pure gravy. The mortgage company now has a absolute massive stockpile of cash. Now you may be thinking to yourself, well, wouldn't it generate more money over the long run for the mortgage companies to keep all of these houses they foreclosed on and then sell them on the marketplace for around full value? While technically true, the reality of the US housing market is most people looking to buy houses are going to get 30-year mortgages and things like that. So it might not be until decades in the future when these banks can realize all of the profits that they can potentially generate from these assets. Most US banks, like most US companies, are far more interested in chasing short-term profits. They want to accumulate a ton of money in the short term that they can then distribute to the shareholders with the expectation that a lot of the people holding stock in the bank or who are managing the bank aren't going to even be working there 7 years from now. That's just the reality of how the US economy works. These private equity funds that buy these houses in bulk, meanwhile, don't have shareholders. They're not as interested in chasing short-term profits unless it's something they want to cash in and out of real fast. But normally they're more patient. They can wait a little bit longer if necessary to realize a profit on an investment. So let's say you're a private equity firm, the country is in a bad recession, and you agree to buy tens of thousands to hundreds of thousands of bulk houses that have been foreclosed on for a deeply discounted price. So from the perspective of the private equity firm, you're buying these bulk houses for, let's say, around a quarter of the price that they would normally sell for when the economy is doing healthy. You're able to buy these houses at such a steep discount because, for one, you're buying in bulk, and for two, it's an economic recession. So it would be hard to sell these houses at full price anyways. For the next 5 years or so, the private equity firm can try and rent out as many of these houses as possible. There ought to be a large market that exists for rental houses, given the high number of people that have lost their homes due to a foreclosure. Once you've been foreclosed on, it impacts your credit, so that someone who's had their house foreclosed on isn't going to be able to reapply for another mortgage for at least several years. So while the private equity firm generates rent from these houses, around 5 years go by and the housing market returns to normal value. In just 5 years, the private equity firm has managed to quadruple its investment. It can then sell all of these houses back to consumers at full price. If another economic catastrophe hits, the process can be easily repeated. This is a perfect example of how the US economy is designed so that working class people and middle class people fail. And at the same time, rich institutions like banks and private equity firms will always win. The system isn't designed to help middle class, working class people build equity in their home so that when they retire, they own their own home. The system instead is set up to treat working class Americans trying to own their own homes as lemons on a lemon tree. The idea is that you take the lemons, you squeeze as much possible out of them, then you throw the shriveled lemon aside. Once that lemon has had an opportunity to ripen again, then you repeat the process. That's how working class homeowners are treated by the system. Not as individuals with agency, but as agricultural products to be consumed and discarded. Anyways, that's all I've got to say on the matter. There probably won't be a new video this weekend. If you're not subscribed to my channel and you enjoyed this video, please subscribe.